Welcome to Decarbonizing the U.S. Energy System, Science Policy Fellows event. So at UC San Diego, we are tackling the interrelated policy and technology challenges that must get addressed to get global carbon emissions to zero in a world where costs matter. And tonight, we're going to delve into what will it take, how do we get there, can the U.S. be a global leader and pave the way for other developed economies to follow? Tonight we're going to discuss these questions and more. So this is the sixth roundtable discussion for the GPS Science Policy Fellows Program with the goal of creating bridges within UC San Diego's areas of excellence. This program pairs STEM PhD students with GPS faculty members who guide them out of their sort of technical comfort zones to explore policy relevance and implications of their dissertation research. And so tonight's panelists are all mentors for the program and also my esteemed colleagues here at GPS. So I'm going to just start off a little bit by framing the issues from my perspective, which is not an energy expert, but as a climate scientist. And then we'll hear from Professors David Victor, Michael Davidson, and Gordon McCord, with plenty of time, hopefully, for questions at the end from you. So I think, every day now we hear in the news some new study or piece of current events that's documenting some threshold that we've passed in the Earth system, some sort of devastating impacts that are already playing out due to climate change around the world, or the irreversible damages that we're projected to experience to natural ecosystems or vulnerable communities if we don't do something to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we're pumping into the atmosphere. And while the exact number varies depending on the accounting system we use, we know that more than half of our greenhouse gas emissions come from energy. And so we can't solve the climate change problem without decarbonizing the energy system. And I mean, every country, every state, every city faces sort of very unique challenges, both technical and political, in tackling this problem, and figuring out technological solutions is not enough to solve the problem. And indeed, it's these political and institutional challenges that tend to be the thorniest ones when it comes to this particular issue of decarbonizing our energy system. And so all of our panelists tonight are very well equipped to speak to this interplay between the technical and the political when it comes to this important problem. And so with that, I'm just going to introduce our first speaker, Professor David Victor. David is a professor of international relations and the Center for Global Transformation Endowed Chair in Innovation and Public Policy at the school. He's co-director of the Laboratory on International Law and Regulation and the UCSD Deep Decarbonization Initiative, which is a joint effort with Jacobs School of Engineering, which catalyzes research here and teaching related to sort of radical reductions in emissions of warming gases in the real world, where both the political and economic constraints matter. His research focuses on highly regulated industries, such as electric power, and how regulation affects the operation of major energy markets. He's the author of the book Global Warming Gridlock, which was a very influential book for me when I was writing my dissertation, which explains why the world hasn't made much diplomatic progress on the problem of climate change, while also exploring new strategies that would be more effective. And he's published hundreds of articles in places like Nature, Science. He's a member of the Advisory Council for Nature Climate Change, a board member of Climatic Change, and joined the board of the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, in 2013. So with that, David, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, well, thank you very, I think I'm going to do this. Oprah style here. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. So we're talking tonight about deep decarbonization, and it's a great topic for the focus of the Fellows Program, because these are intrinsically technical questions. The details matter. Very hard to do deep decarbonization while violating the laws of physics. And yet, at the same time, the social science kinds of questions, policy design, institutional questions, the bread and butter of what we do here at GPS, are instrumental, in some sense, determinative of what actually happens. So it's really a pleasure to talk about this topic, especially as somebody who's trained in political science, but is way off the reservation, because most of my time I spend with my colleagues at the Institution of Oceanography and at the School of Engineering. Most of my PhD students in recent years are in engineering, and this is what we do, is this work that's at the intersection of the technical questions and the political and social science questions. So I just want to say four things by way of things we think we know and things we think we're pretty confident we don't know but are important to know about deep decarbonization. The first is, Kate asked the question, can you get there? And I guess it depends on where there is. Eventually, we will deeply decarbonize the economy, but there's a tremendous amount of inertia built into the system already. So we just have to recognize that the ratio of talking to doing about climate change since 1990, when this problem kind of first was sustained on the global agenda, that's when the UN General Assembly resolution passed that set up what became the Framework Convention on Climate Change, created these conference of the parties. I'm on my way tomorrow night by Washington to COP25, and next year the British government will host COP26, and so if it's late fall, it's COP season, and so you get to go to a climate change meeting and talk about fixing the world, and then you go home and the world's not fixed. So there's a tremendous amount of inertia in the system, and my own guess is that we're going to blow through the targets everyone's talking about right now. 1.5 degrees, done. We're going to blow through 2 degrees, I think easily going to blow through 2 degrees. That we're eventually going to turn the corner there, but we have to recognize that there's a huge amount of inertia built into the system. That's why many of us now, reluctantly, are spending more of our time thinking about emergency strategies. Kate's been doing a lot of work over the years, is where we first met each other, on geoengineering, so basically taking control over parts of the climate system and manipulating it directly. We're doing a series of calculations at the Institution of Oceanography now about how quickly could you build direct air capture machines, so physical machines that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Expensive, but if you put the economy in a wartime footing, you can actually make a lot of progress there, because there are trillions of dollars floating around, as Senator Warren reminds us. Once you spend trillions and trillions of dollars, you don't have any more dollars, but maybe that's a reason to get serious about the problem. There's a group across the street at Salk working on how you might engineer plants along with no-till agriculture to absorb carbon in soils. Pretty interesting work. And so that's all emblematic of this mentality that we have so much inertia built into the system, we might actually need to be on a wartime footing to deal with the fact there's a huge amount of climate change baked into the system. First point. Second point, one of the most powerful results from energy modeling, as Kate said, this is fundamentally an energy problem. It's an agriculture problem, and it's an industry problem, and so on. But it's an energy problem first and foremost, the problem of carbon. One of the strongest results in the energy modeling literature is that an economy that decarbonizes is an economy that electrifies, which means that all else equal, the amount of primary energy that's converted to electricity before it's consumed, which is on the order of 2/5 of the American economy right now, depending on how you measure, that is going to go up. And that's in part because we fortuitously have more technological options for reducing emissions in the power sector than in most other sectors. In fact, the only large sector in the American economy that has been decarbonizing over the last 15 years is the power sector. Some of that is because of natural gas, so that allows shallow decarbonization but not deep decarbonization. Some of that is because of renewables. Renewables allow, in principle at scale, very deep decarbonization. So we're kind of lucky in the power sector and unlucky in almost all the other sectors so far. Some of that's just luck, some of that's thermodynamics. And then the other reason I think the power sector has been the place where most decarbonization happens is because you've got a relatively small number of plants run by adults. It's very, very hard to control emissions from millions and millions of decentralized sources. And it's easier to control emissions from a small number of sources run by adults. I mean, that's, not all of them are adults. Many of them are older than adults. But the point is that it's a professional system where you can, in effect, control emissions and then move the energy cleanly as an energy carrier. So this is a very powerful result. There's an open question as to how much electrification we're talking about. Some people have these visions of 100% electrification, and then you just convert all end uses to electricity. I don't think that's going to happen. But that's the central result is very powerful. This is the second of the 4 points I wanted to make. The third point is I think it's really important for us as we think about deep decarbonization to recognize how early we are in this process. On Monday in Madrid, we're going to release a report that looks at all 10 of the major emitting sectors all around the world. This is a report that the Energy Transitions Commission has been instrumental in helping to organize. The British government has orchestrated it. I'm involved with it. A historian of technology is involved with it. A whole bunch of other people have been involved with it. And one of the things that's very clear when you take a step back is you look at every single one of these sectors, we're kind of moving along the diffusion curve for electrification, but everything else is much earlier stage. Green steel, green plastics, cement, on and on and on. These are still kind of research projects, if you like, and not serious deep decarbonization. So we have to recognize how much we don't know. We have to build a system that is adaptive and learning and oriented and experimental, if you like, in the way it operates. And so that's going to be very important. Everyone has their own favorite list of things we don't know. We all like to talk about things we do know, especially I think maybe university professors. We're biased to talk about things we know or we think we know. I think it's very important for us to get comfortable talking about things we don't know. Top of my list is, I think the most interesting question for the future is what will be the energy carrier or carriers. Right now it seems like it's going to be electricity for all the reasons I said earlier. It's quite possible, though, that hydrogen is going to end up being actually a major energy carrier. We see this more in Europe than in the United States right now. Hydrogen is easier to store. It's easier to use directly in a number of industrial processes, production of cement, production of steel, probably production of plastics, a few others. And so it could end up being a more important energy carrier than electricity, clean energy carrier than electricity. Most Americans know very little about hydrogen except that they think it's bad because of the Hindenburg. So let's just say the Hindenburg was more complex than just hydrogen. But I think this is something to watch. This is a blind spot in a lot of our discussions right now about the energy system of the future. I also have a warm spot for hydrogen because the very first technical paper I ever wrote as a graduate student was about liquid hydrogen-powered aircraft. And I built this very complicated model that showed exactly when hydrogen-powered airplanes were going to come into service, how much emissions they would cause reductions in. And it was I was very proud of that model. It was totally disconnected from reality. So I keep waiting for this to happen. And maybe this is just kind of ultimate vindication when we actually get with this one hydrogen-powered airplane that has flown once in the world. It was a Soviet aircraft that was actually a 727 knockoff where they threw the seats out, they filled the interior with a tank of hydrogen. They forgot about how to get the hydrogen into the engine, so they took the doors off, ran a pipe down the side of the plane, put the hydrogen into one engine. It flew once, and it now sits on the ground in an airport outside Moscow. So that was unit number one, and we're still waiting for units 2 and beyond. But it's a reminder of the big uncertainties about the future. The last thing I'll say is about followership. I think here in California, where we're doing a lot on deep decarbonization, we tend to be thrilled with ourselves because we're leaders. We're spending a lot of money working on the problem. I was in Germany a couple weeks ago. The Germans are thrilled with themselves. They're leaders. They're spending a lot of money working on the problem. One thing that's very interesting is that when you add up the emissions from all the jurisdictions that are reliably leaders on the climate change problem, they add up to about 10% of global emissions, maybe 12%. And their fraction, ironically, is shrinking over time. And so the deep irony in this problem is that the more you lead, the less relevant you become yourself to the problem. And so leadership by itself is irrelevant to first order. The only thing that matters when a globally mixed pollutant like this is followership, not leadership. And so everything we're doing, we should be evaluating through the lens of whether what we do raises the odds that other jurisdictions will be doing something similar, and therefore globally we will ultimately be bending down the curve. because it's quite possible, if not likely right now, that the leadership jurisdictions are going to do a lot to reduce emissions and be excited with themselves, and then they're going to look around and discover that nobody's been following them. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Next, we're going to hear from Michael Davidson. Michael's an assistant professor at GPS as well, but also in the mechanical and aerospace engineering department here. So his research and teaching centers around engineering implications and institutional conflicts that are inherent in deploying low carbon energy at scale, with a particular focus on systems with evolving electricity markets. And Michael has done extensive research on China's nascent electricity markets and their effects on wind energy integration. He was previously the U.S.-China Climate Policy Coordinator for the environmental nonprofit Natural Resources Defense Council. Before he joined us here, he was previously an associate in the Environment and Natural Resources Program at the Harvard Kennedy School's Balfour Center, and is also a fellow with the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So, thanks, Michael.
Right. Thanks, Kate, and thanks, David, for setting it up. So I think what I can do is I'll just jump right into what is the challenge of achieving the vision that David laid out, where you dramatically electrify the economy, you power it with hopefully lots of renewable energy, and you probably have to deploy a lot of other things along the way, like batteries and more transmission lines. So I'm just going to try to give you a flavor of what are the big challenges to achieving that kind of vision. So the first is, if you electrify everything, your demand is going to go up, and it could go up quite a bit. So some studies on the higher order say electricity demand might increase by 50% as a result of electrifying all of transportation in the US. So that's a huge amount of energy above what we're currently consuming. Some additional ones coming from buildings and industry. So we have that big increase. Now let's say we want to achieve it with 50% renewable energy, or 80% renewable energy, or even 100% renewable energy. Well, the key challenge with electricity, while it is easy to decarbonize because of the available substitutes that are low carbon relative to fossils, it also presents a huge challenge compared to every other energy carrier, which is that electricity needs to be balanced simultaneously at all across the network. So supply and demand needs to match itself essentially instantaneously. That's very unlike every other fuel carrier that we're used to. You know, you fill up gasoline in your tank, you don't need to drive exactly how much you fill it in as you go along the road. And the same is even true with natural gas pipelines. So electricity is quite unique in that respect. So the big challenge with creating an all-renewable grid is how to manage the variability of low-carbon resources, most of which are inherently intermittent, like wind and solar. So as you move from 50 to 80 to 100%, I'd say the primary challenge that you run into is that you have to overbuild your system. So you have to build more capacity in these renewable energy than what you actually consume, because it's not going to always be reliable everywhere in the system. So what that turns into is two problems. One is you can still have periods where you don't have enough supply from the renewables. You also can have periods where you have way too much supply from the renewables, and you can't just store it in large mass like you would some other fuel. So the key challenge there is curtailment, and the threat that when you build too much renewable energy, some of that needs to be wasted or curtailed. And just roughly, if you go from, studies have looked at the US power system, you know, all of these are relatively speculative. They depend on lots of different cost assumptions. But if you were, say, move to a 50% renewable energy grid, you know, you may have curtailment of a few percent. If you move to 80%, it may go up to 10%. If you went to 100%, if you can achieve that, you may have wasting 50% of the energy that you're producing. That means that a lot of extra money is going into building capacity that you don't actually use all the time. In order to achieve those really high penetrations, you have to think about all the different technologies that go into that. And so I'm going to kind of roughly stay around the 80% or the 50 to 80% mark. And so for that, you're going to have to build a lot more transmission lines. You're going to have to build a lot of storage for electricity, which can help manage some of this variability. You're going to have to make demand much more flexible to respond to changes in wind and solar output. And you're going to have a portfolio of all of these. You're not going to be able to build PV panels covering an entire half of the country and assume that's going to solve your problem. This is an issue even here in California where we have very good solar resources. So just to give some numbers on this, because there's a lot of talk now about 100% renewable energy goals and can we achieve it by 2040, 2035, 2030? You know, what would that mean kind of in practice on the ground? So just kind of a rough study that NOAA did, and you can go on their website, it's called News. If you do an 80% GHG reduction model, which is still not 80% renewables, but 80% GHG reductions, that might require around 1,000 gigawatts of wind and solar. Currently, we have maybe 150 gigawatts of wind and solar. So if you subtract those and you divide by 10 years, you're looking at 80 gigawatts a year. If you give yourself till 2040, that's around 40 gigawatts a year. That's much more than what the US has been building over the last several years and decades. Actually, it's somewhat comparable to what China's been building just for the last few years because of a huge support for solar, just dramatically ramped up. So China was achieving 50, 60 gigawatts of new installations a year. So that gives you some constraint, but also some optimism that a dramatic policy support could potentially achieve that. And actually, if you just wanted to get a sense of how dramatic that increase would be, you can go online and you can Google the narwhal curve. Someone actually plot out, here's renewable energy currently, and here's what it would have to be in order to achieve the 2030 goals, and it looks just like the tusk of a narwhal. So you can go find that. Shout out to Leah Stokes for creating that. So I want to dive into just kind of two more aspects of this. One is the storage problem. So we hear a lot about batteries. Batteries are going to save us. Batteries are very expensive currently. Now, batteries costs have fallen dramatically over the last several decades, from over $1,000 per kilowatt hour down to maybe $200 a kilowatt hour now on like the cheaper end. Tesla's Powerwalls are still much more expensive than that because they've got all sorts of other costs embedded in them. But some studies, if you want to show that if you want to achieve very deep, over 90% renewable energy penetration, the battery costs need to fall down to say $20 kilowatt hour, right? It's just an order of magnitude lower than what lithium ion currently has. And so I'd say rightly, a lot of people are skeptical that the current chemistry is going to be the solution for that. I think there's going to be a lot of, and there certainly are a lot of different technologies that can help bridge that gap. But then you could also say, well, maybe 95% renewable energy is not going to be the system of the future. Maybe we're going to also have to incorporate some nuclear or incorporate some other carbon capture and storage. You have to think about all the different technologies in the mix. But even if you give a little bit more wiggle room to 80% renewables, then the cost targets you need to meet are much, much more modest. So just give that in context. If storage doesn't come down as much as we hope it would, we can still build lots of renewables. We maybe just can't get to 100% in the way that was currently originally envisioned. So it's just to put it in context in that sense. And then finally, if we just do a very, very simple analysis of, let's say we just wanted to do wind and solar, providing all of our electricity over the entire US, and let's just look at what are wind and solar patterns and what does demand look like, and let's connect them all together. And let's just say, well, if we kind of had no constraints on how much wind and solar we'd want to build, what would be possible? And some of these studies come out with a ballpark kind of an upper limit of 80%. Now this is without having any dramatic storage in the system. That would be a very expensive system, but it would be feasible. The real challenge of getting those additional 10 to 20% is going to be long duration storage. And so I would say that's the unknown. That's the one that would be my unknown in following in David's footsteps is we don't really know how to do that yet in a way that scales. So lithium ion batteries can store electricity for 4 hours reliably. But on days like this, where we're going to have clouds for several days, it's going to cover all of the Southwest, we're going to probably have to rely on some longer form of energy storage, and we don't really know how to do that reliably yet. So I just kind of close with some broader thoughts on when we think about this decarbonization challenge, what should be guiding kind of our broad policy and technical agenda? Well, first is we have to be very robust to uncertainties. And in this case, lots of the uncertainties are related to costs. We just don't know how costs are going to evolve in the future for storage, for any of these other emerging technologies. So we have to be very cognizant that costs will change and also be nimble and create incentives such that we can take advantage when certain costs decline more rapidly than others. And also, if we can at the same time be robust to political changes and build in some institutional support such that new administrations and new politics won't dramatically alter our course. The second is, it's very obvious we need dramatically increased policy support for across the board. We have subsidies for wind and solar at the federal level. They're phasing out. States are stepping in with various incentives and mandates. It's very clear that it's going to require a lot more state and federal support. That needs to be dramatically increased above what historical levels are to achieve anything remotely reasonable for the scope of the challenge. And part of that policy support, in addition to costs, is probably also going to be a level of streamlining, permitting and siting of these facilities and transmission lines and all of the other sort of non-cost transaction barriers to achieving the decarbonized grid. And then finally, going to have very clear financial incentives, because whether you like it or not, you're going to have businesses involved in this, and they're not going to make long-term investments in capital that's going to be around for decades unless there are very clear financial incentives that can't be very easily reneged upon. So with that, yeah, I'll hand it over. Gordon.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So our final panelist tonight is Professor Gordon McCord. Gordon is an associate teaching professor of economics and the associate dean of student affairs here at GPS. He has an extensive background in sustainable development and works at the intersection of development economics, public health, and the environment. His research often employs spatial data and spatial analysis to explore topics such as the evolving role of geography in economic development, the burden of infectious diseases such as malaria and hookworm in a changing climate, and the impact of agricultural technology diffusion. Gordon's also the director of the Certificate in Spatial Analysis program here at GPS and an affiliate at UCSD's Policy Design and Evaluation Laboratory. As we'll hear more about, he's a senior advisor to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and advises developing country governments on integrated rural development and poverty reduction program targeting using data-driven approaches.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm a little bit of an imposter here because if you listen carefully to that entire paragraph, the word energy was not anywhere in that paragraph, and compared to my colleagues, I know an order of magnitude less than either the engineering of energy or the politics of energy. So all of your good questions should be directed to my two much more knowledgeable colleagues. But let me say a little bit about academic efforts that are trying to move the policy needle and trying to bridge from the science over to the policy-making process around the world to deal with complex problems. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network was created for the Secretary General of the UN after the Sustainable Development Goals were announced in 2015, with the idea of trying to mobilize the knowledge networks around the world, mostly universities, but also think tanks, to try to promote the development and the implementation of policies compatible with meeting the SDGs. And it's a network now of 1,200 universities around the world, with 44 national networks, of which the largest is the United States. In the United States, we've got 80 universities across 42 states, and led by 3 universities, Yale, Columbia, and yours truly, UC San Diego. And so we just created this network last year, and it gives us a very large network of knowledge across all of the best universities in this country, with lots of faculty across all sorts of fields that are trying to figure out how are we going to collectively work together to not only on the research side, but on translating that research to policymakers at national level and at state and local levels towards all of the sustainable development goals, of which the decarbonization of the energy system is absolutely central, as you know. So with any network, a lot of the idea is that this allows for a lot of bottom-up organic creation, but if you really want to mobilize a network and have it do stuff, often it helps to have a little bit of top-down catalyzing activity. And the largest project that the SDSN has done globally, launched in 2015, is DDPP, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. And if we rewind back to before the Paris Accords, A lot of countries were on the fence as to whether they should sign Paris. The Obama administration was in that position as well, and there was a lot of unknowns being thrown around. There were people who were saying, decarbonizing is a crazy goal. It's completely irresponsible. It would drive us back to the Stone Age. GDP would have to decrease by 80% for us to solve this. There's no way a responsible country would sign this as an official goal. Other people saying, no, that actually doesn't make sense. If you take a close look and you've got some benign assumptions about the future of technology and costs, then this actually is something that is not going to be that costly and may even end up paying for itself once you take into account externalities of climate change and local pollutants and their effects on health, et cetera, et cetera. But no one had really sat down, or few people had sat down, and certainly it hadn't happened in more than one country, of really kind of very carefully detailing in a very transparent way what would decarbonization actually look like. And so go from now to some mid-century target and say, let's sit down, gather a group of systems engineers, and actually trace for the largest economies of the world what decarbonization would actually look like. When do different facilities go offline? What are they replaced with? How much does that cost? What assumptions do you need to make? What does the grid need to look like? And yes, some of the science isn't quite there, so what are we assuming about the future of technology efficiency and of costs? And write all this down and be able to produce a report and actually a trajectory or a pathway. And that was the idea. So they went to the 16 largest economies in the world, which emit about 75% of greenhouse gases, and they formed teams of systems of modelers, energy modelers, and locked them in a room for a while and say, don't come out until you've decarbonized your economy, and you show us a very clear and transparent trajectory of how one might get that pathway. And so in the US, this was led by Professor Jim Williams at the University of San Francisco and his team of collaborators there and elsewhere. And so they published one of the first, the US is a country with a large community of researchers working on the problem, my two colleagues here included, but other countries hadn't undergone this process at all. So the Mexican team was the first team to actually, in Mexico, show what decarbonization would look like for the country. And that was true for other countries as well. And it was, at least anecdotally, seems pretty impactful for a lot of politicians looking at this for the very first time and saying, oh, okay, so this is not just a conversation of two ships passing in the night. Here's a clear trajectory that we can argue over and talk about, and it's very specific. And in the case of the US, what these folks showed under a couple of pathways is that reaching roughly 80% decarbonization by mid-century was not only feasible, it was feasible without taking any current infrastructure offline before its economic lifetime, and it would cost about 1% of GDP under the assumptions that they were making. And having actually someone trace that, whether or not you agreed with the specifics, and there were uncertainty bounds around that depending on what you assume, et cetera, but it's a very powerful starting point for a specific conversation. And to do that in 16 countries at the same time is also enormously catalyzing, because all of these teams are pointing at the same thing. They're in a common platform. You can have diffusion of knowledge across the country teams. Oh, you're assuming that technology can do that? Why? Oh, okay, I see. That company's innovating in this direction. We can make that assumption. And so the German team can tell the Indian team that this is something they might want to consider, et cetera. And so that international diffusion allows, obviously, international conversation allows diffusion of knowledge across the modelers, and then from the modelers up to the policymakers in these different countries. And so it's a pretty powerful way to try to move the conversation. This idea of pathways, it was impactful here in California when in 2015, I guess, California passed its mandated goal to reduce greenhouse gases by, what's our number? What is California's goal? 200%. 200%. We're in negative territory. What's our 2030 target?
2045 was supposed to be net.
Okay, net neutral by 2045, but that whole conversation in California was very visibly informed by pathway exercises. The idea of reverse engineering from the future, very specifically what we would have to do in order to get to a specific target, and having interdisciplinary teams of researchers, often from different institutions, sitting down and bringing the best science and social science to the table to try to show what that trajectory might look like is going to be a vital part of success. And so SDSN USA, it's the big project for next year, and David and I are working on this, the Pathways project. The idea is we'd like to provide on a silver platter an entire framework of decarbonization for the future administration. And what do I mean by an entire framework? That it's not just the modeling. It's not just somebody saying, what do you have to do roughly when, what comes offline, and where do you do it? But actually, as Michael alluded to, we need an entire conversation on what the policy tools that operate not only at federal level, but at state and local level, in order to get us onto the trajectory. What's the right combination of taxes and subsidies and regulations and zoning, all of these questions that we have, and land use, where are we going to put all these solar installations and wind installations? What's the opportunity cost of all of this land on the ecological side, on the agricultural production side? We've got a lot of serious conversations ahead of us, and we need to decide what the policy framework is going to be. We need a legal framework. We need a team that's thinking about what falls under federal jurisprudence, what falls under a jurisdiction, what falls under state and local, and so teams of lawyers thinking about what's a legal framework for decarbonization that's compatible with U.S. law, and to prepare all of that. I'll lead the land use piece of that conversation. So I've been working on the issues around sustainable land use, which intersects with energy very importantly, as I just alluded to. David will be working a lot on the policy side of things and bringing together, leveraging these 41 universities and more from, or 80 universities from these 41 states, and then activating them to work with their own local policymakers at state level and have this conversation, mirror this conversation from the national level down to the state level, because they're the ones that know from a very specific exercise that needs to be done down in Kentucky, down in Iowa, down in Florida. It's very hard to model the specifics from a single national exercise. You're going to have to do a lot of these questions very specifically down at state and local level. And often it's the universities in those states that are going to have a lot of that local expertise and can sit down with the local policymakers to actually trace out in a very geospatially explicit set of tools to say, okay, here are the new transmission grids, here's where the wind's going, here's where the solar's going, here's what the companies tell us they can do, here's the right policy set of instruments, here's the right legal framework for our state. All of that's going to be a state conversation. It's not going to happen all in Washington, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that that's how this is going to move. And so if we're going to try to move the needle, then there's an important role for catalyzing these networks of willing, coalition of the willing. I hate to use that term, but it's out. Yes, exactly. Yes, that went well. But now you've got this clear and signed up group of scholars from around the country, all with local knowledge of what's going on in their states and local municipalities, to do the exercise of decarbonization on the policy side, on the modeling side, on the legal side, and all to make this as easy a process as can be for the politicians that at the end of the day have to sign above the dotted line, right? If they're not going to do it on their own, let's do as much of the work for them as we can. And in a sense, because this requires so much science and so much interdisciplinary science, it makes sense that we prepare as much of this on a silver platter for them as we can. They don't have the in-house capacity, and they've got that very short political cycle that they think about. We're the ones here at universities who can think on longer time horizons. Our incentives allow us to do that here, and so this kind of networked project would allow that kind of conversation to happen. Again, the diffusion of knowledge of that pathway elaboration process across the U.S. states. And so that's what I wanted to describe to you. Again, far less content knowledge than my colleagues here, but my job is to leverage them and help the rest of the university. So thanks very much.